All right. Hello, everyone. So this week we start our first chapter of biochemistry. Um, the course is half organic chemistry, half biochemistry. This will be our first bit of biochemistry. And again, it might feel like we're taking a little bit of a little bit of a turn here. The way that the material is taught, the type of material is just a little bit different than it is in organic chemistry. Um, yeah, I mean, I'm going to try to make clear to you exactly what's for you guys to know, but nonetheless, just kind of be prepared that it might have a little bit different of a feel. The first thing we're going to talk about is carbohydrates. Okay, so first let's do an introduction to carbohydrates. So many of you guys might have sort of a broad understanding of what carbohydrates are, as they're our main source of energy that we find in the food that we eat. Sugars are a form of carbohydrate. Human beings consume carbohydrates, and then that is sort of broken down within our body in order to produce energy. This is a process called respiration. They're always made up of just the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay. Simple uh, carbohydrates are saccharides, which means sugars. So again, sugars are a type of carbohydrate. There are also complex carbohydrates, which we'll talk about here. Okay. The one thing I'll say is simple sugars, the name carbohydrates come from the fact that simple sugars have this ratio of carbon to oxygen, where it's one carbon atom, one oxygen atom, and two hydrogen atoms. They follow that same sort of pattern. That's only for our simplest sugars. When we get into more complex carbohydrates, that's no longer the case. But that's where the name comes from, carbohydrate, right? Hydrate for water. And it's again because simple sugars have this generic formula that you see written up there. Okay. Carbohydrates such as sugars not only do human beings or animals use them for energy, so do plants, actually. The difference is that plants will actually make their own sugars from photosynthesis, right? So we know that human beings, through respiration, we break down sugars into the CO2 that we breathe out. Plants actually take in CO2 and water and make their own sugars. And then from there, those are the sugars that they use to break down for energy. So actually the metabolism of plants and animals are pretty similar. The difference is that human beings eat their sugars, animals eat their sugars, and plants make their sugars through photosynthesis. All right, main types of carbohydrates, monosaccharides. So these are those simple sugars that have those generic formula like that. And those are only for the monosaccharides. These are the smallest unit of carbohydrates. So you can't break it down. A monosaccharide will get broken down in terms of energy, but it's the smallest unit of carbohydrate. You can't break it down into a smaller carbohydrate. And then you have disaccharides. So really what your body does and plants and everything like that is it links these sugars together. Okay. So a disaccharide is just two monosaccharides linked together. A polysaccharide is more complex than that. It's a bunch of different individual sugar molecules or individual monosaccharides linked together. Okay. So so if we look here, you can't hydrolyze a monosaccharide any further. It's just broken down into its simplest sort of thing. And you see here, we're representing this sugar as this little hexagon. We'll see the structure of sugars here in a second, but just kind of trust that this is a single sugar unit here. Monosaccharides, they don't get broken down any further. Disaccharides, you can break them down into two monosaccharide units. And then polysaccharides are anything bigger than that, right? So if you could break it down, once you have this big old long chain of sugars, and then you can break them down into those individual monosaccharides, okay? So again, the three different types being monosaccharides, that's one, mono, disaccharides, that's two, and polysaccharides, anything bigger than that. There are ones that like you're just going to kind of be expected to know. And I hate memorization, but I've looked through the ACS, some past ACS exams. And the fact of the matter is that there's just some amount of like factoid trivia type knowledge that they expect you to know. For example, They want you to be able to identify the three main monosaccharides: glucose, fructose, and galactose. Those are monosaccharides. The three major disaccharides we're going to be talking about are sucrose, lactose, and maltose. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about each individual one of these, but just these are sort of names that you should memorize as corresponding to these categories. So glucose, fructose, galactose as monosaccharides, sucrose, lactose, and maltose as disaccharides, and polysaccharides. The four big ones we're going to talk about are amylose, amylopectin, glycogen, and cellulose. Okay, those are the four big polysaccharides we're going to talk about. Way more exist than this list, right? There are way more monosaccharides than are listed here. There are way more disaccharides than are listed here. And there are even more polysaccharides than are listed here. These are just the main ones, the ones that are deemed kind of like the most important. Monosaccharides is where we're going to start. So there's going to be two main forms that we see our monosaccharides in. One looks like this, these long chain forms, okay? The other form looks like this, these cyclic forms, okay? When we start talking about carbohydrates, we're going to start talking about them strictly by looking at these long chain forms. We're going to learn a little bit later that actually those cyclic structures are the most important ones when it comes to your metabolism and what's going on inside your body. But for now, when we're looking at sugars, we're strictly going to be looking at these sort of like long chain forms, okay? And we'll talk about, you know, when they form the cyclic stuff and all that good stuff. But for now, the goal is to just see our sugars as these kind of forms. And we're going to notice a few features, okay? So first of all, notice that there is either an aldehyde or a ketone in your sugar. Okay, so sugars will have either an aldehyde or a ketone group. If it has an aldehyde, it's called an aldose. This OSE ending is going to be something we see over and over and over again for sugars. In fact, if we go back to that list of sugars that you were expected to know, notice that all of our monosaccharides and our disaccharides all end in that ose ending, okay? So kind of like how when in organic chemistry, you were introduced to a new functional group and they had this certain suffix like ol or -one or oic acid or whatever. For sugars, that suffix is ose, okay? So if your sugar contains an aldehyde group, it's an aldose. If it contains a ketone, it's a ketose, all right? The other thing I want to point out is, so here are our carbonyl carbons. Notice how every other carbon in this sugar is bound to an alcohol group. Okay, so there are a huge ratio of, in fact, a 1-to-1 ratio of carbons to oxygens within your sugars. All right, one of them is going to be a carbonyl group, either an aldehyde or a ketone. Again, if it's an aldehyde, it's an aldose. If it's a ketone, it's a ketose. All the other carbons are going to be bound to hydroxyl groups or alcohol groups. And then just one other thing to note, when we do see them in these like long chain formats, these sort of structures that we're looking at here, the aldehyde or ketone carbon is always up towards the top. Okay, so you'll always see it with the aldehyde group first, or if it's a ketone, the ketone's as close to the top as possible. Just kind of a standard convention. All right, so again, we can classify our monosaccharides as being either aldoses or ketoses. The other way that we can classify them is based on how many carbons they have. So if it has 3 carbons, it's a triose. 4 carbons is a tetrose. 5 carbons is a pentose. And 6 carbons is a hexose. So given a name aldopentose, you know that that is a 5-carbon saccharide because of the pent, and it contains an aldehyde group. If you were told that you have a ketohexose, that would be a 6-carbon with a ketone group. Okay, So that's kind of the first step that we're going to learn in this chapter, is to be able to classify these sugars based on whether they're aldoses or ketoses, and then whether they have 3, 4, 5, or 6 carbons. Okay. Each sugar has its own unique name. We're not going to like be memorizing the structures of the different sugars. There's literally a bajillion of them. There's important ones that we're going to see over and over again. And so, for example, one of the things that you're going to be given for an exam would be a constants page that looks like this. And so I'm going to give you this for working through some of your homework problems as well. So these are the structures of 3 various sugars. Again, there are the 3 that I said were the most important: the glucose, galactose, and fructose. But you're not really expected to have these structures memorized. What's important is that we know how to interpret these structures. Okay. So for example, we have glyceraldehyde, threose, ribose, and fructose here. You're not supposed to have memorized that ribose has this structure. Okay. Again, the important part is that we can analyze these as either being aldoses, ketoses, and then the number of carbons, tri, tetra, pent, hex, right? So glyceraldehyde, kind of in the name, kind of gives it away. It's an aldose. It's got that aldehyde functional group. And there are 1, 2, 3 carbons. And so that makes it an aldotriose, right? Again, aldo because it's the aldehyde. Aldo because of the aldehyde. Triose because it's got those 3 carbons. What about threose? Well, again, I see, let me just be consistent with my colors here. I see this aldehyde functional group, so it should be an aldo. And then I have 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons. So it's an aldotetrose. Again, that tetra meaning 4. Ribose. Again, I got that aldehyde functional group. So that is going to be an aldo. And then how many carbons? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that should be an aldopentose. And then lastly, we have fructose. This has a ketone. So that would be a keto. Then we have to count carbons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's a ketohexose. Okay, so the main skill that we need to take away from this is the being able to classify as aldo, keto, and then tri, tetra, pent, hex, right? And again, I just wanted to show this cyclic form that you see every once in a while, that you will see a lot, and especially later in the chapter. For now, we're mostly going to look at this straight chain form. Okay, so again, let's do these same sort of deal here. Again, I have an aldehyde, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this would be an aldo. Oops, that was kind of messy. Aldohexose. All right. On this second example B, I instead have a ketone, so it's a keto. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this would be a keto pentose.